Fortunes of the Ottoman Empire rose and fell dramatically. Bayezid's overreaching expansion in Europe and Asia ended in defeat. But the next Sultan, Mehmet I, rescued the empire from chaos and civil war, and his son, Sultan Murad II, led the Janissary Corps on a successful 20-year military campaign in Europe. By the year 1444, after 23 years in power, Sultan Murad II was exhausted.
Murad II was tired of the burdens of ruling and warring and negotiating and really wanted to retire and become a solitary scholar.
Murad II then took an extraordinary and unprecedented step. He abdicated and handed over the monarchy to his 12-year-old son, Mehmet II. But the son's reign was brief, and Murad II's retirement was short, just 2 years. The rise of a coalition of his old enemies, including Hungary and Venice, sent Murad II back into battle. This time, he remained Sultan until his death in 1451. When his son Mehmet II assumed the throne for the second time at the age of 19, he felt he was ready. But the Janissaries, still loyal to his father, were skeptical and rebellious.
The troops, the Janissaries and others, are used to looking to the father for leadership and guidance. And this young kid comes on the scene and people say, well, why should we take him very seriously?
As the empire again edged close to chaos, young Mehmet's enemies circled, watching and waiting. He needed a bold stroke, a conquest that would win over the skeptics. He turned his eyes to Constantinople.
Constantinople represented imperial power, global success.
Primary motivation to capture Constantinople from Mehmet II were the words of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who said, conquering Constantinople would take a glorious army led by a superb commander.
Mehmet immersed himself in military manuals, studying the tactics and weapons of the world's most successful armies.
And he was even dreaming about it. Once he ordered his vizier to the palace in the middle of the night, and he told him, Pasha, Pasha, I can't sleep because my mind is filled with thoughts about conquering Constantinople.
In the spring of 1452, Mehmet ordered the construction of a new fortress just 6 miles from the outer walls of Constantinople. Wanting it completed quickly, the Sultan, with all the energy and impatience of youth, worked side by side with the stonemasons. Rimini Fortress was completed in just 4.5 months.
He built, almost overnight, this enormous castle on the European side of the Bosphorus at one of the narrowest spots on the Bosphorus.
Together, these two fortresses would make it nearly impossible for supplies or reinforcements to reach Constantinople.
Simply being there cut off the ability to in any way provision the city. And that is reminiscent of what we'd seen even a century or so earlier, when the Ottomans traditionally built fortresses outside of cities that they wanted to conquer and starve them into submission.
Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI was terrified. He immediately began to fortify the city.
Imperial Constantinople in 1453 was an enormous walled structure with a few villages inside.
While still the crown jewel of the dwindling Byzantine Empire, Constantinople was no longer the majestic, thriving capital it had once been. The population had shrunk from almost 1 million at the end of the 10th century to just 40,000. But as a fortress, it was still almost impregnable, with 14 miles of reinforced stone walls. In some places, 2 lines of walls as high as 40 feet. It was one of the strongest fortifications of its time.
This gate is one of the entrances to Constantinople. In times of peace, the Byzantines would open these gates to the public and to soldiers so they could enter the city freely. But in wartime, when the city was under threat, they would wall up the gate like this and block the entrance in order to keep the enemy outside. As you see here, the last wall built into this gate was when Mehmet II prepared to attack the city.
Mehmet enlisted the help of a brilliant Hungarian cannon maker named Urban.
Mehmet agreed to pay him 4 times his asking price.
Urban built a battery of advanced artillery pieces, including the world's largest cannon. With a barrel measuring 26 feet long, the giant weapon could fire a 1,000-pound cannonball over a mile. The explosion could be heard 10 miles away. On the eve of the battle, Constantine sent a message to Mehmet. As it is clear you desire war more than peace, so let it be according to your desire. I will defend my people to the last drop of blood. The supreme God calls us both before his judgment seat. Mehmet responded, "The holy war is our basic duty as it was in the case of our fathers. Constantinople, situated in the middle of our domains, protects our enemies and incites them against us. Conquest of this city is therefore essential to the future and safety of the Ottoman state." On April 6th, 1453, the siege of Constantinople began. Constantinople is on a peninsula, and Mehmet's spies had learned that the seaward walls facing the Golden Horn were not as thick as the land walls. But when Mehmet's navy tried to attack, the Byzantines were ready.
Before the Ottomans arrived, though, the Byzantines stretched a chain along the Golden Horn in order to deny access to the Ottoman navy. It was important because by denying access, they could concentrate the forces along the land walls.
Then Mehmet devised a remarkable plan. If he couldn't break through the blockade, he'd go around it. He would take 80 ships overland over a ridge 200 feet high and down again to the water on the other side.
It is quite extraordinary when you think about ships weighing many tons, several tons at least, being dragged on rollers up a very steep hillside. You have this vision of hundreds of oxen and thousands of log rollers, probably greased with some substance or another, and men screaming and pulling in this very dramatic scene.
As soon as these ships made it into the Golden Horn, they started to fire on the walls. Constantine redeployed troops from the land walls.
At the same time, teams of oxen and hundreds of men dragged Urban's monster cannon into position to assault the land walls.
The giant cannon could only be fired 3 times a day.
The big gun, along with Mehmet's other artillery batteries, pummeled the walls. On May 29, 1453, after 7 weeks of intense siege, Mehmet gave the order for what would become the final assault. The wall was breached. As the Janissaries rampaged through the streets of Constantinople, the surviving Byzantine troops panicked and fled. Constantinople was in Ottoman and Muslim hands.
This had been the dream of Islamic conqueror, and now for the first time, this 19, 20-year-old upstart had done what nobody else had done, and this, of course, gave him great prestige throughout the Islamic world.
Sultan Mehmet rode triumphantly to the magnificent church of St. Sophia and ordered it turned into a mosque. The Christian cross was torn down and replaced with a crescent, the symbol of the Ottoman Turks.
The Ottomans had captured the Second Rome. With the capture of Constantinople, the Ottoman Sultan became a Caesar.
The fall of Constantinople shocked Western civilization. There were ceremonies of mourning in St. Peter's in Rome. Pope Pius II urged Mehmet to convert to Christianity. Instead, this Muslim sultan declared the city the capital of his Islamic Ottoman Empire. With this monumental victory, Sultan Mehmet had changed the course of world history and forever would be known as Mehmet the Conqueror. It was the beginning of the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. The conquest of Constantinople was a towering achievement for both the Ottoman Empire and its young Muslim sultan, Mehmet the Conqueror. Mehmet's new capital took on a new name, Istanbul. He quickly set out to rebuild. He refortified the battered city walls, rebuilt the city skyline, and commissioned his own great mosque.
What he wanted to do was to make Ottoman Constantinople, Istanbul, into the rich and powerful city that it had once been.
With a location that bridged continents and cultures, the city had prospered for centuries through trade. The new sultan ordered construction of the legendary Grand Bazaar, still the largest covered street bazaar in the world, where textiles, crafts, jewelry, and spices were traded in an intricate maze of covered streets.
The Ottomans stood across the major trade routes that connected Asia, China with Europe.
Mehmet gathered whatever and whomever he needed. To revitalize the city's merchant class, he recruited tradesmen and craftsmen from across the empire. Everyone would take part in the city's rebirth. Christians were invited back with the promise of protection. Jews in neighboring Salonika were encouraged to come to Istanbul. New craftsmen brought new skills. Silk from the early Ottoman capital Bursa, along with wool, goat hair, and cotton, were woven together into intricate carpets that became the Ottomans' most famous export. In 1465, the 33-year-old Sultan Mehmet II began work on the crown jewel of his new city, the extraordinary Topkapi Palace.
Concentric circles of power, the outermost circle being the least powerful. And as you get closer to the center of the palace, you get closer to the person of the Sultan, and therefore closest to the locus of power. It was intended to be both a symbol of power, but also the actual place of power.
The massive 173-acre complex would ultimately include 10 mosques, 2 hospitals, 5 schools, 12 libraries, and 22 marble fountains.
We have the registers of the food purchased and the cost and the amounts. At least 5,000 people a day were fed here. So this was a massive operation.
Topkapi Palace was, in fact, a city within the larger city of Istanbul. Mehmet governed both in royal fashion.
He took over much of the trappings of the Byzantine emperors, of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Mehmet's religious tolerance and his broad interests in art and commerce transformed Istanbul into the vibrant new center of the Islamic world.
He surrounded himself with Byzantine historians, philosophers, writers, diplomats. He was, I guess, as close as I can think of to a sort of Ottoman Renaissance man as one can imagine.
But his civic interest didn't alter Mehmet's military goals or aggressiveness. Rebuilding Istanbul required money, and new conquests generated new revenues. For 25 years, he waged war against the Christian territories, pushing the outer boundaries of the empire into Romania, Albania, and Bosnia, and dominated his enemies. His primary goal was to conquer Christian lands, then subdue them and tax them. After an extraordinary 30-year reign, Mehmet the Conqueror died of natural causes on May 3, 1481. He was 49. Mehmet had reinvented the empire, but he had also left it somewhat exhausted. After years of constant military campaigns, the Janissaries were tired and growing mutinous. Islamic religious leaders were also angry. They resented the Sultan's attempts to assert his authority in what were traditionally religious matters.